Chapter 11. Hot water, Mrs. Meshel. Thus started out of a few hours of my sleep by my landlady's too cheery bellow. I groaned aloud. My triumphant feelings in regard to my brother Sherlock had vanished overnight, replaced by terror of possible consequences. Miss Meshel, are you awake? Confound the deaf old woman. She had not, of course, heard my less than civil response. I felt disciplined to get up and go to work, and one would think I had been laid at bed, for the terms of Miss Meshel's employment with Dr. Ragaston were exceedingly lenient. Yet I could not sleep through the morning in my own lodging without exciting the curiosity of my landlady. Miss Meshel? Mrs. Tupper rapped on the door. Ye gods, I muttered naughtily to myself, before I called aloud, I'm awake. Are you up? Yes, thank you, Mrs. Tupper. Of course, Sibry blood pudding that morning for breakfast. I loathe blood pudding. On that and other accounts, Mrs. Meshel reported to work in an ungracious frame of mind. Yesterday, perhaps fortunately, there had been no time for me to think about my brother Sherlock, but now I realized the danger he presented, as he knew so much more than he should. As evidenced in Ivy Meet Me Steps, British Museum. He knew my assumed name. He knew Dr. Watson had said that I had money. He knew of my enciphered communications with Mum, and had decrypted them. And worst of all, at any moment he might learn much more from his best friend, the aforementioned Dr. Watson. Suppose my brother relented of his rudeness to Watson and confided in him, and suppose that Watson then confessed to Holmes concerning his visit to Dr. Ragaston. In the space of one simple conversation, Sherlock Holmes could have his attention quite thoroughly focused upon Ivy Meshel. Curses, I muttered as I entered my office. Curses, bosh and humbug. Suppose crows turn white. Sitting down by the hearth, I pushed fear out of my mind, as if not quite out of my shivering body. Sipping tea, I read the morning newspapers, replete with all the usual shocks and horrors. An anti-vaccination mob in the East End had threatened the district nurse. Several female charity workers had been arrested in Holywell Street for giving out pornographic materials about preventative checks to childbirth. A gas explosion had violated a home in Knightsbridge, killing 3 servants and causing great distress to the family. It was rumoured that dock workers were holding clandestine meetings of a subversive nature. Agriculture continuing to languish due to cheap imported corn from America, etc. But there was still no word from Mum. Confound everything. It was cold, I told myself, that made me shiver. In the time it had taken me to go through the newspapers, the fire had dwindled considerably. I bundled all of them into the grate, and in that temporary blaze of warmth, and triumph mind over matter, I marched to my desk. Brother Sherlock could go. Go to the phrenologist. And there was nothing I could do about Mum. But if I wished to call myself a purgatorian, I had better get to work. Seizing upon my sheaf of foolscape, rapidly I penciled several small likenesses of Lady Cecilia's lovely head. On one of them I sketched an elaborately trimmed wide-brimmed hat, upon another a flat gypsy bonnet, on another a straw boater, on another a tiny hat supporting a spray of feathers, as was the latest fashion, and on another a plain shawl. The fire died down again, and the room grew colder and colder. I shivered, my fingers stiffening so that they held the pencil with difficulty, but I kept drawing. I depicted Lady Cecilia with a hair in a bun and no hat at all, then with a rag of cloth wrapped around her head, and then in a maid's cap, with a comb that stood at the back of her head like a wren's tail, with a snood and finally a veil. Finished to my satisfaction, I reached for the bell pull and rang. Joddy, I requested when that eager boy appeared. Would you replenish the fire, please? He sprang to do so, taking a seat in the armchair, stretching my hands towards the welcome flames. I left my sketches on the desk, where he would see them as he returned from refilling the coal scuttle. Surreptitiously, I watched him from the corner of my eye. He glanced at the drawings, and then he jerked to a halt, staring. And after that it did not matter that I turned my head to watch him with interest, for his whole attention had fixed on the sketches. I got up to stand beside him. "Do you still recognize her?" I asked. Quite forgetting his manners, he nodded. I let his lapse pass to ask, "When did you see her?" "I don't rightly know, Miss Meshel." "Last year?" "No, this past week or two." "On a street corner? With a basket?" "Yes." "And what was she wearing?" He pointed at the picture of a girl with a rag wound around her head. "Ah," I murmured, so surprised that I forgot any further questions. Indeed, I felt rather weak. What one wears around one's head, you see, indicates one's station in society as surely as if one wore a placard around one's neck. And in this case, Lady Cecilia's placard would have said, "Desperately poor." So much for my theory that, like me, she was attempting to minister to London's destitute. Instead, it would seem that she had joined the ranks of those who live in poverty. Several hours later, in a paisley dolman over an expensive but restraining visiting dress of Parisian blue merino, Mrs. Ragiston once more approached the stately residence of Sir Eustace Alastair, Baronet. But rather than going immediately to the door, I stood in the pavement, studying the baronet's abode. While mansions in the country tend to spread horizontally, those in crowded London are necessarily built on a vertical plan, with the kitchen in the basement, the dining room above, served by a dumb waiter, the drawing room above that, away from the noise and dirt of the street, bedchambers on the next floor, and the children's nursery and schoolroom on the next, and so on up to the servants' quarters and the attic. Lady Cecilia's bedchamber, I knew from my previous visit, was located on the children's level, just below the servants' quarters. Studying the distance from that floor to the ground, I shook my head. Then I remembered my ladylike charade in time to restrain my usually long-legged stride. I minced around the side of the house to see whether the situation somehow looked better from the back. It did not, of course, and while I peered at Lady Cecilia's windows, several astonished servants paused in their outdoor tasks to peer at me. "You!" Imperiously I beckoned to a scullion boy struggling with slop buckets. "Come here." He obeyed me instantly, of course, even though he had not a notion who I was, for I had assumed the manner as well as the clothing of the ruling class. When he stood before me, I asked, more quietly, "The ladder by which Lady Cecilia took her leave, where is it kept?" For the ladder must necessarily be on the premises. No one could carry such a thing through London at night without being noticed. Rendered speechless by such a frank question on such a forbidden subject, the lad merely gestured towards the carriage-house, which was quite large enough to have provided lodging for several families, less blessed with riches than the baronets. In the carriage-yard stood a handsome barouche, with 3 grooms were polishing, or had been until my advent which shocked them motionless. I sailed towards them. "Let me see this ladder," I commanded. One of them, presumably he was the most presence of mind, led me into the carriage-house and pointed upward to where the ladder resided upon the rafters. A very solid wooden ladder, in 4 sections, any one of which would have been quite heavy for me to lift, and next to impossible for me to get down from its storage place without help, and all 4 of which needed to be fastened together and raised all at once to reach Lady Cecilia's window. "Thank you," I said, and walked away as I had walked in, without explanation. With my thoughts in a sort of yarn basket, I snarled. I was coming to find customary. After pausing, breathing in a well-disciplined manner, invoking the memory of my mother's face in order to steady myself, I approached the front door and knocked. "Be timid," I reminded myself, as the scowling butler faced me. Dr. Ragiston's child bride, homely, bashful, and terribly naive. It was quite easy at that point for me to feel myself naive. This time Lady Theodora awaited me at the top of the grand staircase, receiving me formally in the drawing-room, making it all the more difficult for me to communicate to her the most peculiar and irregular thoughts upon my mind. As did a dress of 3 fabrics, black taffeta, bodice, and train over a violet velvet skirt, draped to show a finely pleated underskirt of grey silk. This costume and a heavy necklace of glinting black gems offset the pallor of her lovely face. Elaborate as her gown was, yet because of its colours I felt as if already she were in mourning, as if her daughter Lady Cecilia had passed away some time ago. With a head erect and a cold look on her white face, Lady Theodora stood to greet me, but I noticed that in a few days since I had seen her last, she had grown perceptibly thinner. Crossing the room to her instead of any of the usual polite preliminaries, I blurted out, "You must not give up hope, my lady." For a moment she stiffened, and then her dignity crumbled like ice on a stream when the spring floods break it away. "Mrs. Ragostin." Sagging, she reached for my hands, and we sat facing one another on a settee, nearly knee to knee. "Oh, my dear Mrs. Ragostin, I know I must continue to hope for the best, but how can I, when there was no news at all of my daughter?" She leaned towards me, even more anxiously trembling. "Has Dr. Ragostin found any trace, any sign, any clue of my poor lost Cecily?" I answered cautiously. "There are some indications, perhaps." "Oh!" One hand flew to her jeweled throat as she grasped for breath. For the sake of her dress, she wore a compressed waist today. That is to say, she was tightly laced, and a wretched corset made this conversation most difficult, lest she fall down in a faint. "Dr. Ragostin considered that once again I should be the one to interview you," I murmured, "rather than himself, for the matter is delicate." "Yes, of course. I am all in a flutter, that is. I had begun to fear. I assure you, Dr. Ragostin has looked into the case most assiduously. Of course, he has requested me to ask you something. Anything." Once more she clasped both my hands. I took a deep breath, which I was able to do, for I wore a corset only to hold my hip regulators, and bust enhancer in place. I asked, "Was Lady Cecily left-handed?" A simple enough question, one would think, but not when addressed to a member of the aristocracy. "Certainly not." Lady Theodora snatched herself away from my touch. "What? I never. A baronet's daughter left-handed?" Having surmised it might be this, I had prepared myself, reacting not at all to Lady Theodora's bristling shock, her outrage. I murmured in soothing tones, "Of course not now, my lady." A lie, for I believed the girl indulged her left hand in the privacy of her rooms. "But when Lady Cecilia was quite small, one can hardly expect an infant to be aware of the proprieties, can one? At that time, did she exhibit any tendency towards left-handedness?" Lady Theodora's glare slid away from my meek but direct gaze. Looking at the velvety flowered carpet, she muttered, "Perhaps her nurse might have mentioned something of the sort." "Did her governess ever comment on it?" "Why, it is difficult to recall. If Lady Cecilia was ever at all left-handed, why, the inclination was trained out of her, of course." This was an admission of such magnitude that it sent shivers up my spine, and not for any reason Lady Theodora could have understood. Indeed, I doubt I myself would have been taken such a viewpoint if it were not for the extraordinary freedom of my own upbringing. But having been raised by a mother who believed in letting growing things alone, I was imagining how it must have been for Lady Cecily. Her baby fingers had been smacked when she tried to use the wrong hand, toys taken away from her left hand and placed in her right, and all the scoldings. Her left hand might have been tied behind her when it was time for her to learn to print her letters. Or, through her schooling, her knuckles must have been often rapped. Or her left palm might have been beaten with a strap. And along with these restrictive torments, she had undergone all the usual rigors of learning to be ornament to upper-class society. She had walked with a book on her head for perfect posture. She had learned to embroider with her right hand, and be well-versed in all handicrafts with her right hand, and draw blurry little candy-coloured pastels. But could it be that her left hand wrote large, dark thoughts in her journals, and her left hand created strong, stark charcoal drawings? My mother had mentioned to me, it seemed, so long ago, those wild and free childhood days at Ferndale Hall, but really it was less than a year ago. We had both read a new shilling shocker, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which reminded Mum of the study of the human mind recently begun in Germany, where alienists attempted to better understand insane people by means of concepts such as idée fixe, dual personality, and the like. She had demonstrated dual personality by folding a photographic portrait of in half lengthwise, directly in the center of the subject's face, then holding each half against a mirror so that it formed a new face subtly, yet startlingly unlike the original. Could it be that Lady Cecilia was a dual personality? Could it be that the Lady Cecilia who used her left hand was an entirely different person than she who used her right? Chapter 12. I passed the remainder of the day in a dismal frame of mind. How could I have been so stupid? Somehow I had started off by thinking that Lady Cecilia could and would do the same things I might do, such as take pity upon London's poor. Not a valid assumption. Or run away. Not a valid assumption either. Or lift a large heavy ladder. Nonsense. The ladder. My word, I was a fool. The ladder was the first thing I should have inspected, and also I should have thought far sooner of the garments I had seen in Lady Cecilia's wardrobe. Petite dresses that would have been worn by a girl much daintier than I. How ridiculous ever to have believed Lady Cecilia could have put the ladder in the window herself. I doubted that I could have done it, no matter how badly I wanted to. Also, I had no basis of thinking Lady Cecilia wanted to. I had no reason to assume any of her ideas or inclinations were at the least a bit like mine. I had been blind. And I called myself a purgatorian. I needed to do far better. I needed to take my wayward mind in hand, so to speak. Apply stern logic. Reason this matter through. Accordingly, as soon as I had reached the privacy of my lodgings that evening, I sat myself down with a portable desk in my lap, and a candle pulled close on either side to do just that. On paper. Very well. Regarding Lady Cecilia's disappearance, what were the possibilities? I could think of only three. She eloped. She ran away. She was kidnapped. In favor of elopement, I wrote down, appearance of same. The ladder at the window. Secret correspondence with Alexander Finch. Secret meetings. Same. Against. No mentions in journals of consuming passion for Alexander Finch or otherwise. Use of grey sealing wax only. Bed slept in. Why? No clothing missing from her wardrobe. Lady not found with suspect. Alexander Finch most unlikely object of lady's affection. I hesitated over that last, as being subjective rather than strictly illogical, but eventually let it stand so that I could move on. She ran away in favor of. She felt strongly about social and reform issues. Reference her journals. She maintained a double personality. Charcoal versus pastel. She broke her pastels. Inference she no longer wished to be that person. Against. Who helped her? She could not have put the ladder in the window herself. Why use a ladder? She could have walked out the door. Why was her bed slept in? What did she wear? Still not feeling much wiser, I attempted the same reasoning process with the third possibility. She was kidnapped. In favor of. Ladder to window. Needed because no access otherwise. Bed slept in. Her slumber was interrupted. No dresses missing. She was taken in her nightclothes. Imagining Lady Cecilia being snatched from her bed by some villain at midnight, actually shuddered. How perfectly dreadful. And the more I thought about it, possible Indeed, more in keeping with the facts than either of the other hypotheses. But again, there are objections against. Why did she not scream? Or why did no one hear her? How could she have been taken down the ladder? Why was she chosen as a victim, and by whom? Why has there been no ransom demanded? Regarding the first objection, it could be explained away by saying that the kidnapper or kidnappers had rendered the lady unconscious before she could scream, perhaps by the use of chloroform. And again, regarding the ransom and the choice of victim, it was possible, quite possible, that Lady Cecilia had been taken for another nefarious purpose, on which I preferred not to dwell. Indeed, I only dimly understood this practice, called white slavery. The idea seemed terribly far-fetched, and best dismissed, for how could the unconscious lady have been carried down such a tall ladder? I had heard that firemen could sling persons over one shoulder and manage a short descent that way, but for even the strongest man to attempt this from the fourth floor, how very risky. Foolhardy indeed. Stupid. Why had he not simply taken her down the stairs instead? But the evidence showed plainly that this had not been done. The ground floor doors had remained barred, and the window locks had not been disturbed. Perhaps he had lowered her from a bedchamber window with a rope and sling. With the ladder in the way? The other window? Hardly, as it was placed directly over the railed-off cellarway area in a water butt. Regarding the back window, then, there would have been at least two kidnappers, one of whom would have descended and moved the ladder away from the window while the other one lowered the unconscious lady, then replaced it so the other could come down, and then they would have to carry her inert form away. Oh, how absurd! They? Who were they? And surely such elaborate goings would have been noticed by the constable who patrolled every few minutes in that well-to-do neighborhood. So much for the stern application of logic. It led one towards the most preposterous conclusions. Of the three possibilities, Lady Cecilia eloped, Lady Cecilia ran away, Lady Cecilia was kidnapped. Not one seemed any less ridiculous than the others. Nothing made sense. I was a fool, not a purgatorian. Throwing my papers on the fire, I lunged to my feet, lifting my mattress and pulled out my habit. Fear of being garroted again now felt preferable to feeling so inept. That night, after Mrs. Tupper had retired to her bedchamber, the black-clad, heavily veiled sister slipped out to see whether she could do anything for the London's poor. The famous pea soup fog of London was so thick that night that my own lantern seemed to float like a ghost at the end of my arm, lost in nearly palpable murk. On nights like this, or even in daytime when the air turned to yellow-brown smut broth, cab drivers needed to lead their horses on foot, and watermen sometimes stepped off the docks along the Thames and were drowned. While ordinary pedestrians, even more so than usual, fell victim to foul play, right now a cutthroat could be standing within 6 feet of me and I would not see him, or a garroter. The thought made me shiver as the dank cold knot, shudder with the memory of that fearsome force seizing me from behind, squeezing, strangling, and then only blackness, until the blurred memory of some horrid man lifting my veil before I fled. Altogether dreadful that night, the blackest of memories, as evil as the foul device itself. Absurdly simple. A stick of malacca wood, and stay-lacing of all things, still clinging onto me afterwards. Mentally I attempted to push the image away. This was no time to dwell in such a terror, not with all but tangible shadows of London night around me. The hearkening constantly for any hint of danger, I walked on, not searching for unfortunate tears tonight, but instead making for a destination. I could stand my own apprehension only just so long, but at the same time I told myself that many more Londoners died of sheer breathing than ever died of crime. It could not possibly be healthful to inhale air that made one's eyes and nostrils turn black. I could bear it. I had been raised in the clean air of the country. But what of those who had been born to breathe soot, to live and die in these grimy streets? London's poor, I had noted, grew stunted and died soon. One could hardly begrudge them their gin. Huddling together to sigh for the night, even the poorest folk could often lay hands on a bottle of gin, which they passed around in order to make their cold and wretched lot more bearable. By day they distrusted strangers, but by night the drink loosened their tongues. This fact, I believe, explains the timing of my strange encounter. Well laden with my usual supplies, I hurried towards the workhouse, where the poorest of the poor, destitute old women called dossers or crawlers, spent their nights and days on the stone steps. By long-time custom, they were allowed this small mercy instead of being knocked about by the police, as was the lot of ordinary beggars. Poor old things. They would be burning street sweepings if indeed they had any sort of fire at all. Rounding the corner of the workhouse, I halted for a moment, astonished. Instead of the expected shadows I saw upon the workhouse steps, I met a washtub in which considerable blaze merrily burned. There would be no need for me to light one of my tin and paraffin devices tonight. And instead of seeing shivering old women huddled together beneath the blankets, I saw gathered around a fire, their gaunt faces grinning, and with them, a man. An old man as hunched and crone as they were, his long grey hair and beard hanging down none too clean, and his shabby clothing even dirtier. Poor as poor can be. Yet somewhere he had got fuel for such a handsome fire, and the unlikely respectable in which to carry it, and saw a bottle of gin, and for some reason he had chosen to bring these things here. Close beside him sat the most pitiful of the dossers, her half-naked body and a ringworm-infested head, along with the rest of a threadbare personage, covered by the waterproof ivy mesh we had given her 2 days before. The waterproof that had previously belonged to a woman selling pen wipers from a basket. "Sister!" she called as she saw me approach, her voice enlivened, yet slurred by alcohol. "Sister, have a toot of gin." It was not necessary for me to reply, as the black-veiled sister never spoke, nor was it necessary for me to reject the hospitality with so much as a gesture. The dossers were accustomed to my ways. Silently I began handing out bread, etc., which the poor women grasped eagerly enough, but not as desperately as they might have done under their usual circumstance. "Widowed, I did so until me eyes gave out." The woman in the waterproof was gabbling to the old man, who had evidently asked her to tell him a story. As I was unable, due to my muteness, to make any such request, I listened with great curiosity while pretending not to. "Then I tried peddling flowers in front of the theatre, you know. Or then arranged the old toughs would stop to buy bouquets for their ladies. I stood in the rain anyway, took the coffin, one jolly mess led to another. I got turned out in me room, in me very first night in a common lodging house. Some artless devils stole me a little bit of money and all me clothes. Me boots, me dress and apron, well, everything except the shift I slept in was gone. I cried to this one, that one, to no avail. So it was cold and hungry in the streets for me. For how can I find work without any decent covering for myself? No." In answer to the man's offer of another swig of gin, "I've had no more of that. I was falling over, I'll be, even more so than customary." Indeed, I had few times seen the old woman fall when they tried to walk. Such was the extremity of their misery. The greybeard said, "God forbid such ill fortune should ever beset me little Ivy." Ivy? Only the fact that I was already pretending to not listen kept me from giving myself away. Perhaps actually I did stiffen, or startle. But in the night and the flickering firelight, I doubt anyone saw. And the ragged, hunchbacked old man was not looking at me, anyway, but at the dossers and the waterproof as he spoke. "My little granddaughter, no more than 14 years on this cruel earth. Less than a week ago she went out to sell pen wipers and such from a basket." My heart started to pound, with the tears running down her face. So From misery, I felt the oddest, wrenching sensation within my chest. And she hadn't been heard of since. I wanted to run away. Therefore, knowing I must show no sign of what I was feeling, I continued to pass out foodstuffs, working my way towards the stranger. Stranger? In a sense, yes. You were wearing a waterproof much like that one you got on. His accent impeccably lower class. What if you don't mind telling me? Before he could complete this question, I thrust a meat pie in front of his nose. He turned to accept it, in his very dirty face. Beneath the filthy cap and filthy beard, I saw keen grey eyes looking up at me. Why, thank ye. With greatest fervour, mentally I reminded myself that he could see nothing more of me than a muffled, mantled, veiled, almost shapeless silhouette in the night. He asked me, You prowl through these parts, sister? Begging your pardon, would you chance to know whereabouts a skinny, stick-old girl called Ivy? I handed him cheese to go with the meat pie. Told for her age she is, he continued, but if you feed her beans, she'll look like your rosary. She would, she's that thin. One of the dossers told him. The sister of the streets won't answer you. She never says nothing. I begs your pardon. Something of his genteel courtesy sounded through his Cockney accent. Thank you for the food, sister. In no way could he know how truly he spoke. I was indeed his sister. It was my brother, Sherlock. Chapter 13. The next morning, Ivy Meshel, for the first time since her visit to Baker Street, reported to work without fear. No longer did that worthy secretary need to fret, for Sherlock Holmes did not seek her. He was on the hunt for a poor street vendor who had worn a waterproof. So I felt better, yet worse, for I had heard a quiver of emotion. The genuine article, I sensed, not just an actor's rendition in my brother's voice, when he described me as a skinny girl crying with wretchedness. Surely he realized I did not actually live in poverty. He knew I had money. But just as surely Mrs. Hudson had told him how miserably I had been weeping when she let me in. Confound everything. Intent only on getting my cipher book back, I hadn't realized how such news might affect him. How could I safely reassure Brother Sherlock of my well-being? Such were my troubled musings as I entered the establishment of Dr. Leslie T. Ragiston, scientific purgatorian. Good morning, m'lady, cried the eager boy in buttons as he took my ulster. Joddy, I told him with some asperity, have you ever considered that other employees might change your rather ridiculous name to James, or Cecil, or Algernon just to suit themselves? No, m'lady. No, Miss Meshel. Just so, Joddy. Miss Meshel is how I prefer to be addressed. Please be good enough to bring me the morning newspapers and some tea. But I scanned the papers without pleasure, for there was still no word from Mum. Well, surely in a day or two. But I so badly wanted her to advise me about Sherlock. Without the benefit of her greater wisdom, how might I take action? Send my brother a letter of reassurance? But he was so confoundedly clever. What if he somehow traced it back to me? Place a similar message for him in the newspaper personal columns? But to do so, even in cipher, would be to make our family difficulties public. I could not risk damaging Sherlock's pride even worse than I had already. Moreover, surely Brother Mycroft, who so far cold kidney pie that he was, had not much troubled me or my thoughts. Surely Mycroft would see such a message as well. And what sort of hornet's nest might ensue? I could not imagine. I had no idea what to do. Sitting behind my desk in a shadowed frame of mine, looking over Dr. Ragiston's correspondence, I found myself doodling on the backs of papers I had set aside to discard, producing a caricature of my brother with his cloth cap and his forelock hanging down. Unaccountably, I felt slightly better. Always, when irritated or uneasy, I felt driven to draw. So, supplying myself with a sheaf of foolscape paper, I began to sketch in earnest. Sherlock again, then Mycroft, then Mum, then others. Faces, mostly. The ragged little girl who had swept a crossing for me. The Dosses, the workhouse steps. Lady Theodora in her black jewelry. My mind had gone off in directions of its own. I drew the face of Alexander Finch. To my own surprise, I gave it quite a nasty sneer. Whatever in the world? Sitting back, I closed my eyes and tried to recapture my visit to Ebenezer Finch and Son Emporium. Memories spoke in my mind. Sort of colours one would expect from a screaming anarchist. She'd been reading Das Kapital, and we discussed the exploitation of the masses. She wanted me to show her the proletariat. What I think is, she walked right out of the front door and put that ladder there herself. Had Alexander Finch's father merely been releasing choler, or had he been calling his son an anarchist? I knew anarchists were blamed for dynamiting Victoria Station, attacking the offices of the Times, and most recently attempting to blow up the Tower of London. But other than what I saw in the newspapers, I knew nothing of these foreign assassins, these secret societies. Were anarchists something of the Marxist sort? Yet Alexander Finch had led me to believe that Lady Cecilia was a Marxist. But if so, why had she mentioned nothing of such beliefs in her private journals? He had ascertained that she had put the ladder under the window herself, but having experienced the pleasure of her dainty acquaintance, he must have known that this was simply not possible. Lady Cecilia had met Alexander Finch. Lady Cecilia had corresponded with Alexander Finch. And Lady Cecilia had gone missing. Surely not entirely a coincidental series of events. Yet the police had failed to find her at the room, and they watched him constantly. Or so he said. How foolish of me to accept his assurance and Lady Theodora's that he was under constant scrutiny. How much did I know, really know, about Alexander Finch? Very little. I arose from my desk to go talk with him again. However, this time it was not Ivy Meshel who sallied forth to the department store. Instead, it was Mrs. Ragston. Or not Mrs. Ragston exactly, for today I wore a rich satin and velveteen day dress, not at all dowdy, and I would exhibit no timidity of manner. Alexander Finch had my ladyed me. Very well, I'd be a lady, or at least gentry, and I'd see how he liked that. I paid my sixpence a mile in order to arrive at Finch and Son in a cab. A handsome cab, despite the cold, because I wanted a good view of the building's exterior. Warmly wrapped in my long fur cloak, I did not immediately exit the cab, as it drew to a halt in front of the Finch establishment. I took my time, looking not at the glittering mercantile palace of brass, gas, and glass, the Emporium itself, but instead peering skyward, studying the building's upper stories, where the clerks lodged, dormers, gabbles, drain-pipes. Closely approximating the dormers and gabbles and drain-pipes of the buildings on either side. Meanwhile, a uniformed constable, looking quite dull, stood across the street, no doubt stationed there to watch the front door in case Alexander Finch came out. Humph. Exiting the cab and dismissing it, I sailed into the department store with my silk-gloved hands, in my fur muff, my hat towering with ostrich feathers, and my skirt regally trailing. I would like to speak with Master Alexander Finch, I demanded condescendingly to the first clerk I encountered. A slight, freckled, rickety sort of young man, he visibly fumbled for words before speaking out to reply. Alexander Finch, I'm not sure he is in just now, my lady. I arched my brows and feigned ire and genuine astonishment. This hapless clerk was more afraid of young Finch than he was of me. I remembered how the willowy girl at the shoe counter had fled at young Finch's command. At that misfortunate moment it occurred to me to wonder, Why had that peculiar youth chosen to converse with me in the shoe department while walking past, for instance, gloves? Because he liked boots, I suppose, especially the lace-up sort. He enjoyed pulling the lacings tight. Why, he had quite strangled. I felt the strangest chill run through me, as my personage comprehended a moment in advance of my mind. Indeed, suddenly felt so weak that I swayed on my feet. "My lady," the clerk's anxious voice seemed to reach me from a great distance. As those other voices had sounded so far away that night, as I regained consciousness with the garrote still around my neck, I remembered terror, blur, fog, the nondescript man lifting my veil. I remembered where I had seen Alexander Finch's face before. The freckled clerk cried, "Help! Somebody! She's going to faint!" An excellent idea, as my intentions had quite a sudden about-face. I now fervidly wished to avoid speaking with Alexander Finch. He must not see me. And while I had never feigned a faint before, it seemed simple quite enough. Rolling my eyes upward as I closed them, I began to collapse towards the floor. "Catch her, then!" Another male voice, rather cockney, spoke close to my ear as the fellow grasped me under the elbow. The rickety clerk, I think, took my other arm, and allowed myself to sag in the hands of my supporters as they hustled me through a door somewhere off to the side of the store. "Lay her on the bench," said another voice, a woman's this time. "Who is she?" "Dunno. She wanted to see Master Alexander." "Cool. Somebody ought to warn her." I felt my personage being placed as directed, gently enough considering how unyielding a wooden bench is. Someone began to unbutton my high collar. Easing my eyes open just enough to peer through my lashes, I saw that my good Samaritan was a female servant of middle age. The high-backed bench faced the hearth, hiding the rest of the room from my view. But I surmised, if only from that rude item of furniture, they had taken me to the clerk's tea and luncheon room. "What did she want to see him for?" asked a man's voice. "I dunno. Right wrought up she was." "Do you think, with the swag she's wearing, on her she might be a shipyard boss's wife, like, or a factory owner's, trying to talk some sense in her about all the trouble he's stirring up?" "I always did say them factory uns are rough yet, especially them match girls." Unbuttoning my cuffs to chafe my wrists, the servant evidently considered herself to be on equal standing with the clerks, for she spoke her mind. "Them and their so-called strike. Too mulleted to touch them chemicals and working 14 hours a day now. It's not the match girls he's fomenting any more. It's the dockmen and what they want with all that free time's beyond me. Doing whatever they like, and the carters and such, spoiling their reputations, luring good girls out of their domestic service, and this poor lady fainting away for want of proper care. Where's the smelling salts, for the love of mercy? Oh, right here." With my eyes once more firmly lidded, I laid still as the pungent restorative was presented to my nose, disciplining myself not to respond, for I wanted to hear more. While my person and face appeared, I hoped, insensible, my mind hopped, shrieked, and grabbed like a child presented with sugar plums. Formant? Alexander Finch? Dock workers? Match girls? Strike? Hadn't Joddy mumbled something about a match and a strike? One of the male voices was saying, "The carters is mostly being sensible, what I hear, but the dockyards is all like a pot on the boil, to strike a blow for workers' rights, what they call it." "She ain't coming round." My nurse sounded worried. "Get me her scissors so I can cut her stay lacings." Oh. Oh no. She must not be permitted to see my corset. I bestirred my eyelids slightly. "Wait a minute," said the kindly lady. At the same time, an unmistakable voice roared from somewhere close at hand. "What's going on here? Get back to your stations." "Yes, Mr. Finch. Yes, sir. The lady fainted, you see." "Lady?" bellowed the elder Finch. What lady? I interjected a moan in order to deflect his attention from his clerks onto me. "Oh, send for a doctor," he barked. "You men get back to work. You've got no business loitering about when a lady's lying down." The door slammed behind their various voices. I opened my eyes, smiled weakly at the servant, and told her I was feeling better. "Thank you so much," but my overly fed, candy-grabbing mind snatched at loitering. Alexander Finch had been just a bystander, perhaps, who had chanced to be loitering about on the night I was unconscious, lying in the street, which was only a few days after Lady Cecilia had disappeared, when the police were supposed to be keeping a close eye on him. Each thought made me feel queasier, more faint and ill, but I forced myself to smile, stand up, and take my leave, for matters of the utmost urgency required my attention. Chapter 14. Before the shadowy smoke-clotted day could darken to even more shadowy night, I returned to the vicinity of Ebenezer Finch and Son. I will spare the gentle reader a full account of the risks of detection I had run in the interval briefly put after changing back into Miss Meshel at Dr. Ragston's office. I then, at my lodging, alluded Mrs. Tupper to an exit as a nun, wearing my heavily veiled habit for the sake of its total concealment of my features, even though it made me an object of curiosity. I felt the glances of passersby as I walked out of St. Pancras Station. Those Londoners had not seen me before. In this reasonable, prosperous area, there was small need for the sister of the streets ministrations. Not that I had ventured here for the sake of charity. I came empty-handed, so to speak, as my gloved fingertips, beneath my mantle folded almost as if in prayer, rested upon the concealed hilt of my dagger. I ventured nowhere near the resplendent front of Ebenezer Finch and Son Emporium, instead approaching that seductive establishment from the rear, through a maze of mews where cart horses and milk cows were kept. I stopped in the shadow of a pigeon cote to survey the terrain. Once again I studied the Finch's building windows, roof-lined and rain-spouting with an interest which architecture had never before inspired in me. This was the first time I had occasion to regard a building as a structure to be climbed. As if surveying a winter tree for the best way up and or down with my gaze, I traced different routes until I decided how I would do it. Predicting then where the rapidly darkening back passageways Alexander Finch would descend, I retreated once more into the concealing mews, made a circuit, then found myself a sheltering doorway in which to wait. Before it was quite dark, as I had expected, for he needed to be able to see his way down, somewhat, and he could not give himself away by carrying a light. Just at nightfall, where he came like a sort of monstrous caterpillar along the rooftops, creeping along shillings or tiles on his knees and elbows, keeping his head down and staying out of sight of any constable who might be standing watch in the street or at the store's back door. From time to time I lost sight of him behind chimney stacks, but always in a brief while he reappeared. With a nimble ease that showed how often he had done this before, he swung himself across the gaps between buildings. Having reached the end of the row, he descended to the eaves, swiveled around and let himself down by the water pipe onto the wooden top of a covered water barrel, and so to the gravel of the corner's chandler's delivery drive. I could just make out the pale mask of his face, eyeglasses and all, as he glanced around. Rather than the dandified garments in which I had seen him previously, he wore the rough, dark flannel and corduroy of a day labourer, and a cloth cap. As soon as he had made sure there was no one nearby, or so he thought, he strode off towards the street. I let him get well ahead of me before I slipped from the shadows and followed. This northwest London was a quarter not nearly so poor as the East End. No ladies of the night or water spigots stood on the corners. Folks here had their own vices and their own plumbing, but neither was it fashionable nor rich. Nondescript, like Alexander Finch's face. With streets neither crowded nor deserted, it was an area I knew only a little. I could count on the fingers of one hand the times I had been in this part of the city, to visit Dr. Watson, to burgle my brother Sherlock's lodgings, and twice to shop at Ebenezer Finch and Son Emporium. 4 times, not counting the venture of the moment. It is no wonder I rather lost my way as I followed Alexander Finch. And on several occasions I nearly lost him. It was fortuitous, a night rather less thick than usual, but even so darkness abounded. I had seen the electric lighting along the Thames embankment. Utterly amazing, nearly turning night to day. By comparison, the wavering flames of gas street lamps only interrupted the night, did not vanquish it. Most of the time Alexander Finch, like the other folk on the street, remained a shadow amongst shadows. I could see him clearly only when he passed directly under a street lamp. So that he would not see me, and likewise I walked in the middle of the street. A venture, I hoped, never to repeat. In daytime it would have been dangerous. At night, and all clad in black, it was doubly so. Even with their oil lamps lit, the carriage drivers could not see me to avoid running me over had I not dodged them. No simple matter, as the footing consisted of nameless, icy slop and horse muck. More than once I nearly fell, and one time I did indeed lose my footing and had to roll across the cobbles to keep myself from being trampled under the horses' iron-stud hooves. I struggled up, skirt and mantle wet and dragging, just in time to get out of the way of a great clopping Clydesdale pulling a lumber wagon. Indeed, there were so many carts and wagons now. Alexander Finch had led me into some sort of warehouse area adjacent, as nearly as I could reckon, to the great produce market. Covent Garden. Where on earth? But even as I wondered, he halted at a decrepit doorway, over which an ill-lettered placard advised. Beds 6pence, night women's ward 8pence, tea, bread, washing water, extra. In other words, the poorest sort of doss house, or common lodging house, with flea and lice-infested cots set in rows. The sort of place where the pitiful, hairless crawler on the workhouse steps had lost a few remaining possessions to a thief. The sort of place that had likely given her the ringworm in exchange. I guessed it could not believe what I was thinking, whom young Finch expected to find within. But rather than knock at the door, he stepped around the corner of the slovenly building, out of sight. Biting my lip, I stood like a black muck-coated statue on the far side of the street, for, I admit, I simply did not know what to do. If I followed him into the narrow space between buildings, surely he would notice me. Yet if I did not follow him, I had to. Muttering something naughty, I strode across the street, but as I neared the Doss house, to my surprise, a strange man stepped out of the shadow where Alexander Finch should have been. A man with long black hair and a spade-shaped full black beard. Only the skin around his eyes showed, starkly pallid beneath the beard, for he wore no eyeglass, and his eyes, even though they did not look at me, I felt their force. Even in the night I saw how curiously bright, almost silver they were. Beneath my veil my jaw dropped, my mouth gaped, and only with the most arduous mental discipline did I keep myself from gasping out loud. The man was Alexander Finch, in disguise. But I would not have known him had it not been for the cloth cap, flannel shirt, corduroy jacket, and trousers he wore. Intent on his business, he had taken no particular note of me amongst the others passing by. As he turned his back to knock on the door of the Doss house, I slipped into the hiding place he had just quitted. He knocked hard, impatiently upon the door until it opened. Then in honey and vinegar tones, Finch inquired, "Would my lady care to take the air?" She did not answer, only slipped out of the dark doorway like a frightened animal. Indeed, I would not have kept a dog in such a hole. "Give me the lantern." She carried a lantern. Apparently, I saw movement, and then Alexander Finch struck a match, and on my first plain sight of Lady Cecilia, I struggled anew to keep from crying out. I would not have known her had he not led me to her. Indeed, I think her own mother might not have recognized her gaunt, pale face, her hair all in a dirty tangle beneath the cloth tied around her head, her shivering shoulders warmed only by a shawl, her skirt threadbare and tattered, her feet wrapped in rags. Only because my pencil had traced so many times those delicate features could I believe my eyes. Lady Cecily, a beggar girl carrying a large basket. He lit the lantern and handed it back to her. She said something, although she spoke so timidly I could not hear the words. "Work first," he answered aloud. "Food afterwards." Again she murmured, her eyes huge and pleading. But this time, instead of answering, he puffed his lips in exasperation, then peered at her and darted his fingertips towards her face, as if he were shaking some sort of fluid out of himself and onto her. His own face had gone very still, his curiously light-colored eyes fierce, focused, gleaming. His hands traced several sinuous passes around her head, then down over her shoulders. I would not have believed it had I not seen, but I saw. Without ever touching her, he took her utterly into his power. All hope and yearning, all her feeble life force faded from her eyes, so that she stood like a mostly unlikely porcelain doll, starveling and ragged in a sooty glass bowl. "Work first," her master repeated. "Food afterward." Without another glance at her, the wild-haired, black-bearded scoundrel walked off in the direction of Paddington Station, and she limped after him, carrying both lantern and basket, like a ragtag tied to his elbow. He was no taller than most youths, but her head, bowed barely, reached the level of his shoulder. Staying well behind them, but allowing myself the luxury of the pavement this time, I followed my mind in a hullabaloo of horror, curiosity, and speculation. For I could not quite yet take in what I had seen. And all the while my entire person, indeed my very skin, tingled with urgency to do something, assist her in some way, intervene. But how? And against what, exactly? I could not yet make sense of the circumstances. I could only watch. At a corner opposite a public house, some rough-looking men clotted beneath a street lamp, I saw Alexander Finch, with Lady Cecily trailing behind him like a child, stoop to greet them. After handshakes all around, they set up a wooden crate of some sort, and Alexander, or the black-bearded impostor I could scarcely believe to be Alexander, got upon the improvised dais and started to speak. Keeping to the shadows, I stood too far off to hear properly, but I caught references to capitalist oppression, empire built upon the backs of exploited labor, workers' rights, and so forth. Undoubtedly, I was observing Finch, the outside influence, of which the newspaper columnist spoke, in the very act of fomenting unrest in the working class. Specifically, the carters and dock workers, as the clerks of the Finch Emporium had said. That they knew of the young master's nighttime activities surprised me not at all. Servants and the like always knew everything, although they would tell nothing, except to one another. Ascending to his speaking platform, Alexander had given Lady Cecily her orders, and now she stood at a small distance from him beneath another gas lamp mounted upon the wall of the corner building, rather woodenly reaching to a basket, and offering each person who stopped to listen something small and white. My word! Geordie had said he'd seen her with papers. Pamphlets for a labour union of some such rabble-arousing endeavour. Already a considerable crowd of men and very few women had gathered to listen to Alexander Finch's harangue. I would perhaps be not unduly noticed if I approached, just another bystander who happened to be a nun on the street. After considering for a moment, I decided to take the risk. Trying to show neither haste nor hesitation, I walked towards Lady Cecily. "The opiate of the masses," the bearded Finch was declaiming from his— yes, I think actually it was a soapbox. "As all too plainly demonstrated in every good English aristocrat's favourite childhood hymn, all creatures great and small, the Lord God made them all. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly, and ordered their estate. The good Lord God is said to have decreed that 3/4 of the populace shall live in labour and bone-skewing, mind-stunting poverty, while a favoured few shall occupy their days by having their servants assist them in 5 changes of clothing. One could not help but admire the fervour and clarity in which he spoke. He was brilliant. I agreed with much of what he was saying. It was hard to believe the foul deeds of which I suspected him. Yet one could speak truth, and still be a villain. And there stood Lady Cecilia. A few heads turned as I reached the edge of the crowd, but most who stood upon that corner list wanted only to listen, whether in shock or in admiration. As for Finch himself, intent as he was on his oration, I hoped he did not notice the black-mantled, veiled sister of Charity. Or even if he did, I imagined he could not at this moment devote much thought to our previous meeting, under what had been, for me, most unpleasant circumstances. As for the girl with the basket, she stood as dull as the soot falling all around us, and as silent. Only when I passed directly in front of her, half-heartedly she poked a flat pamphlet at me. It was necessary that the mute sister of the streets must speak tonight, if never again. "Lady Cecilia," I whispered to that personage as I accepted her tract. She did not look at me. "Lady Cecilia," I spoke softly, yet close to her ear. I am sure she must have heard, yet she did not respond at all. Not with a blink, a breath, a glance, not even with a startled twitch. "Twice we have assembled peacefully, as is our right," the street corner platform speaker passionately declaimed. "Twice we have marched to Trafalgar Square under the silken flags of our guilds, to adjure the West End of London to remember us. And the police have beaten us back with billy clubs, and after we withdrew bloodied and defeated. This is what one member of the Parliament had to say. It is in bad taste for people to parade their insolent starvation in the face of the rich and trading portions of the town. They should have starved in their gardens." The crowd now overflowed into the street, as far as the opposite pavement. Yet amongst all those bystanders, one heard not a sound except the voice of the black-haired orator. Alexander Finch's vehement silver glance passed like magnetism over and through the crowd, and to a man the listeners stood entranced. They gazed as if they were— Finally I allowed myself to think it. Mesmerized, like Lady Cecilia. Chapter 15. Mesmerism. The stuff of music hall entertainment and parlour amusements. I would not have believed it had I not seen it. But I had seen him do it to Lady Cecilia. However briefly, I had seen him make the magnetic passes with his hands and penetrate her with his gaze, as Mrs. Bailey amongst others had described to me. And now Lady Cecilia stood before me on a street corner, listless in rags and automatron, forgetting her hunger in order to hand out anarchist pamphlets. Just looking at her, I wanted to scream with frustration. Desperately, I desired to help her, free her, rescue her, do something. But what? Go fetch a police constable? But he would have no knowledge of the disappearance of Lady Cecilia, and therefore no reason to detain her. Race to tell Lady Theodora all that I knew, then let her deploy the authorities? But that would take hours, perhaps even a day, and in the meantime, what if something happened to Lady Cecilia? "Let them set the imperialist police on us," cried a captor to the street corner crowd. "Let them give us another bloody Sunday, for next time we will colour our flags with the hue of our beaten heads. Next time we will fly red flags of revolution." And the men tossed their ragged caps in the air, wildly shouting, cheering for the new-found Messiah. But I knew that beneath the wild black wig and false beard, he was no working-class hero. He was a sham, a rich shopkeeper's son, and he was glorying in the power in which he swayed the crowd. He liked to wield power, apparently. Watching the subjugated girl, Lady Cecilia, I knew I could not turn my back on her even for a moment, lest she disappear again. I must get her away from him. Here. Now. But how? Unmesmerize her? This was done, I had heard, by performing the magnetic maneuvers in reverse. It seemed most unlikely that I could accomplish it. Seize her and carry her off bodily? But then I would be pursued as a kidnapper, for she would cry out and struggle against me. I knew that she wouldn't, for while she looked as meek as a dove, standing there with downcast eyes, handing out pamphlets, tame as she seemed, I knew full well there was another side to her, not the Lady Cecilia who drew smudgy pastels, but the left-handed lady who drew bold, dark... Wait a minute. Lady Cecilia, or the one pauper girl whom I knew to be Lady Cecilia, was giving out pamphlets with her right hand. And as this realization flashed upon me such an electric illumination of simultaneous conjecture, hypothesis, and hope burst upon my benighted mind, that I am sure my eyes went as round as bull-eyes' lanterns. Safely hidden by my black veil and my mouth gaped, I whispered, "Oh, my stars and garters! Oh, if only I could do it!" Make contact with the left-handed lady, acting on the premise that only the proper and docile right-handed Lady Cecilia had fallen in the power of the villain. If the secret, rebellious left-handed lady lurked unfettered within this meek creature before me, I had to communicate with her, and quickly, and in a way that would cause her to connect with me as if by telegraph wires, almost instantly. More by instinct than by conscious thought, I knew how it might be done. Her charcoal drawings, you see, had strangely affected me, touched some deep recognition in me, almost as if she and I could be soulmates. Perhaps just, she might similarly recognize me. So, reaching into the pocket for pencil and paper I always carried with me, I opened the political pamphlet, hid the paper behind it, and standing with the gaslight to my back, so that only the gaunt, listless girl in rags could see, I drew. Instinct, again more than conscious thought, told me what to draw, how best to depict freedom as Lady Cecilia had experienced it. Doing so, I sketched as rapidly and well as I had ever had done in my life. I drew a likeness of Lady Cecilia, dressed in stylish modern Turkish bloomers, pedaling a bicycle, skimming the earth by her own power, as I too love to do. Lady Cecilia, strong and beautiful and smiling, with the wind ruffling her hair and blowing her hat ribbons in the air. And as my pencil flew, out of the tail of my eye I could see the right-handed pauper girl grow motionless, forgetting her assigned task of handing out political tripe. I saw her stiffen, her gaze riveted upon the drawing. I switched the pencil to my left hand. Very clumsily I began to scrawl beneath the drawing, from right to left, in mirror handwriting. Who... But I had gone a bit too far. She dropped her basket, and before I could complete the sentence, the question, her left hand shot out, snatched the pencil and paper away from me. Dull as soot, no longer, she stood before me like a small and icy flame, demanding, "How dare you? What do you think you are doing? Who are you?" Luckily, no one around us paid any attention, for the crowd roared with agreement with Alexander Finch as he harangued. "Let them set their sabre-waving cavalry upon us. Let them massacre us as they did at Peterloo. Yet we will persevere." Lady Cecilia sounded as if she quite wanted a sabre to wield upon me. Who are you? And on that spur of that moment, oh dear, how the cavalry metaphor does take hold. I mean, at that time of crisis, not knowing how else to calm her and answer her, I did something the sister would never have done, had never done before. I lifted my veil. I let her see my face. My long, plain, Ciceronian face. She stared. She took a breath and let it go in a puff, as if blowing out a candle flame. "Why?" she said softly. "You're just the girl." She continued to study me, as if both puzzled and intrigued. "You draw marvellously well," she added. I thought of the superb charcoal artwork that she had never let anyone see, and something must have shown in my face, something that made her smile. You're no nun, she said in a light tone, as if teasing a girlfriend. Whatever are you doing in that absurd habit? In my most aristocratic accent, so that she would know that we were alike in class, as well as in other ways, I responded. Lady Cecily, one might also ask. I meant to twitter about being a baronet's daughter dressed in rags, but as I spoke her name, she froze and let out a squeak, almost a scream as if she had not known I knew her, as if she had not heard me call her by name before, as if she had been deaf then, but could hear me now. Her reaction, fortunately, went unnoticed amongst the cheering of the crowd. Lady Cecily, I tried again, there is no need for alarm. I wish only to befriend you, to take you somewhere warm and safe, give you supper, and get you out of those rags. She looked down at herself, then up at me with a wild, frightened stare, then all around her bewildered and half panicked, as if she scarcely knew where she was. The company here is most unpleasant, I gently remarked. Shall we go? Taking a left hand, bare and blue, her poor hands chafed with cold, I drew her a few steps away from Alexander Finch and his mob of followers. The working man has a right to unionize for fair hourly pay, that street corner orator bellowed, and a fair working day. Lady Cecilia stopped where she was. No, she faltered. No, I can't. Why not? My tone remained soft and even, for above all, I must not excite her again, must not risk drawing Finch's attention to her, and to me. My loyalty, the cause, the name of Cameron Shaw shall be written in the history of England. He'll be a great man some day. Who? Cameron Shaw! With a glance of fervent devotion, she indicated the black-haired, black-bearded rabble-rouser on his soapbox. Do you mean to say you have never heard of him? Soothing and almost truthfully, I answered. I am most anxious to hear all about him. How did you meet him? It was most peculiar. With a brow creased, she stood again, bewildered, her eyes watering while she shivered in the cold like a lost child. Come, I told her, and again taking her by the hand, I led her away. At the first corner I veered onto a different street, out of Alexander Finch's sight, should he chance to turn his head. Then breathing out, I slowed my pace so that Lady Cecilia could get along more comfortably, stumbling on her half-frozen, rag-wrapped feet, but also so that I could attempt to decipher where we were and where we were going. Nothing looked familiar about any of the empty streets I scanned. I neither saw nor heard anyone else nearby. This neighborhood seemed most deserted on a winter night, although anybody from a pickpocket to Jack the Ripper himself could have lurked in the foggy, smoky shadows between the street lamps. Lady Cecilia's teeth began to click like my rosemary. Such was the chill of the night and her fright. Stopping for a moment, finding in my pockets some of the strength-replenishing candies I always carried with me, I gave them to her. As she fumbled to unwrap one and placed it in her mouth, I took off my fur-lined gloves and put them onto her frigid hands. I opened my mantle and invited her to share its warmth, wrapping it around both of us, my left arm around her shoulder as if she were a little sister, and in my right hand, fingering the hilt of my dagger as we moved along. So, tell me, I asked her once more gently, how did you meet this, Cameron Shaw? I can barely speak of it. You think I'm mad. I promise you, I will think nothing of the sort. How did it happen? In a dream, she replied. He came to me in my sleep, in my mind, like a black-haired angel summoning me to be a handmaiden of his crusade. Ah, I murmured in what I hoped was a comforting, encouraging way, although I had to exercise my strongest self-control to keep from shuddering at the image forming in my mind. The disguised villain standing over her bed as she slept, staring at her with his eerie eyes, passing his hands over her slumbering innocence to penetrate her with the vital principle of his animal magnetism, taking her into his power before she could completely awaken. I was chosen, said the trembling lady. Called, like Joan of Arc. Yes, I understand. You do understand, don't you? Good. I had managed to keep my furious feelings out of my voice. All in a relieved rush, Lady Cecily spoke on. Then I awoke in the middle of the night, and there was no one in my room, but the cold was so strong that I got out of bed. I knew exactly what I must do. There were humble clothes laid out waiting for me, a skirt and a blouse and shawl such as a washerwoman might wear. I put them on over my nightgown. The window was open. I climbed out. I climbed down. The fearsome memory halted both her words and her feet. We stood on a benighted crossroads, and I recognized nothing in any direction, not even to tell east from west or north from south. Blindly choosing a side street, I set off again, herding her along with me before I spoke. Down the ladder. How do you know? But without waiting for an answer, she went on. Yes, the ladder. And it was so high and it trembled I was terrified. But I had to do it. Cameron Shaw, you know, he was waiting for me at the bottom. Had you ever met him before? No, never, except in the dream. That is what makes it all so very uncanny, you see. So, she did not recognize Alexander Finch under that false hair and fake beard. Alexander Finch, shopkeeper's son. I remembered how I had first seen him as nothing more than a nondescript youth, dressed like a gent, but aside from dandified clothing, a nothing. How woodenly he had stood, seemingly without spirit, as the older Finch had ranted at him. But now I began to understand. All that rage had not been wasted upon him. He had taken it in, a lifetime's worth, and had made him a person whom I should be very loath to trust. Lady Cecily stiffened into my arm, my mantle, as suddenly as if she were a puppet and someone had pulled a string. She halted and said in a strange tone, I ought to be getting back. Back where? Home. I have no home. Certainly you have a home, a baronet's mansion. With Daddy always and forever droning about the burden of empire and the progress of man, meanwhile intending to marry me off to anything titled and wearing trousers. No, I cannot go back there. I tightened my arm around Lady Cecilia's shoulders, touched by her honesty, and by her conversation. One must realize that I had gone for the better part of a year lacking any intimate conversation with another human being, and this girl was so much like me after all. Just talking with her, I experienced great warmth of feeling for her. There are other possibilities, I said. Such as the life you have chosen, perhaps? How did you do it? Who are you? You have not yet told me your name. And, I yearned to tell her all about myself, my most lonely, peculiar, eccentric self. Maybe it would not after all be necessary to return her to her life of smudged pastels and the polite, right-handed taking of tea. Maybe she could instead live, like a sister, with me. Chapter 16. I felt my lips trembling as they parted. I felt my breathing hasten. I heard myself say, Enola, my name is Enola Holmes. And I would have told her more. I would have told her all about myself, if it were not that, just at that moment, a voice intervened from the darkness. Cecily, come here. The voice of a master, not far away. Lost in circling, I'd failed to get her well away from him, and I am sure you think that I overspeak, gentle reader, when I say that I felt the presence of his rage like a force of nature in the night. But I tell you merest truth. His fury vibrated in the sooty shadows, palpable. I felt Lady Cecilia startle like a frightened fawn, and cringe and began to shake. "I must get back," she whispered in terror. "No!" I held on to her as I wildly scanned the neighborhood for some escape or refuge. At last I recognized the nearby street. I had visited there. I knew where I was, and which way to flee. But she broke away from me. "Lady Cecilia, no!" She never so much as turned her head in farewell. Indeed, she seemed not to hear me, nor did she run from me. Like a somnambulist, she walked away from me, or rather, towards him. I could see him now, a blacker form in the darkness at the bottom of the street. While I stood rigid in the shadows, she shuffled towards him like a blind person, in grimed rags that once might have been white. "Cecily?" He saw her in the street lamp light. Although I heard no gladness in that recognition, I heard fearsome peril. "How dare you leave your work? Come here!" It appeared that he had not heard or seen me, yet. I pulled my veil down to conceal my face. He stalked towards Lady Cecilia. She walked to meet him. In the middle of the shadowed, deserted street, she faced him, head bowed as if she were a naughty child. I heard him speak to her in tones that mocked yet menaced. I did not catch the words, for my attention was fully occupied with any sounds I myself might make, slipping towards them. I saw him lower his bearded head to breathe into Lady Cecilia's face. I saw her cringe. Taking a twisted way through the deepest shadows, I crept nearer to them, quite near, without being seen. "Listen to me, you worthless chit," he was saying as I tiptoed towards him from one side, and his anger would have been fearsome enough in and of itself. But there was more. It was the mesmerist commanding her, the magnetizer holding her helpless with his cobra stare. "You shall obey me, or you will be punished. For your disobedience tonight, you will forfeit your supper. What have I just told you? Speak!" Like an echo of him or a ghost of herself, she started to whisper, "For my disobedience." At that moment, I charged. With a yell worthy of a street urchin, I darted both hands into the mesmerist's face and gripped his hair. Savage, screeching, tugging as hard as I could with one hand, I snatched off his wig. With the other, I pulled off his false beard. Lady Cecilia shrieked. Had she been corseted, I believe she might have fainted. But with a great gasp she rallied, crying, "Alexander Finch!" There he stood, in his own head naked even of his tinted eyeglasses, seeming unable to think what to do or say. "Alexander Finch!" Lady Cecilia shouted, outraged. It was as I had thought. She would bear ill usage from one whom she admired, but she could not abide being deceived. "Impostor! Fraud!" All had reversed in that moment as I stood aside, flinging the disgusting, hairy objects in my hands down in the street. "How dare you play me for a fool?" "Silence!" he told her with an attempt at his former authority. "Silence, you vile beetle, no, you maggot." He did indeed rather resemble a maggot, with his round pale head, his pallid eyes. "You worm! You may well wish for silence, but I will not rest until every police court in England has heard of your infamy." With a glare fit to cut him open like a razor, she turned to walk away. But this man knew no shame. He grabbed for her. "Don't turn your back on me, I am talking to you." She eluded his grasp, but marched off, not running away. On frozen feet, wrapped in rags, she walked at an aristocratic pace. Perhaps hers had been a dual personality once, but not any more. No one could have mistaken her for a pauper in that moment. She sailed like a ship on the Thames, every inch a lady. "Wench, don't you dare defy me!" She made no reply, but to keep walking. "Proud bitch, I'm warning you." And although Alexander Finch's voice did not rise, something in his tone turned me colder than the night ever could, and raised the small hairs on the back of my neck. Dual personality? No, It was not Lady Cecilia who had gone the way of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I saw her hasten her pace slightly as she kept walking. "No chit of a girl turns her back on me," shouted Finch as he whipped something out of his pocket. Something long loop of white, something to ride like a white snake in the night. It is one thing to suspect, or even to know in one's heart, but quite another thing actually to see. The sight stunned me out of my wits for a moment, so that I could not cry out. Could only cry out, "No!" and leapt at him to stop him. Most ineffectually, he simply clouted me with the back of his fist, sending me flying to one side, after which he paid me no heed. Perhaps he remembered my panicked flight after our other nighttime encounter, and expected the same. Perhaps he thought no female could do anything more than scream, faint, or run away. Perhaps in his murderous rage he did not think at all. His blow felled me to the cobblestones, where I lay with all the breath knocked out of me, paralyzed for a moment, unable to move. But I could see. I saw that maddened villain spring like a beast of prey after Lady Cecilia, pouncing upon her from behind. He threw the garrote over her head and drew it tight. Lady Cecilia's face contorted. Her eyes rolled skyward. Her hands flew to her neck, clawing at the vicious, unseen thing constricting to cut short her life, just as my hands had done that dreadful night. And in that instant, gasping for breath and remembering, I learned what it meant to see red. The night turned to hue before my eyes, as wrath galvanized me so that I leapt to my feet. My dagger seemed to spring to my hand, so fiercely had I drawn it. Weapon raised, I hurtled towards the garrote. Cruel. He has no reason to enslave her except that he likes to play with power. He had no other reason to attack me either. To strangle me senseless, nearly to death, before. Although only perhaps by chance interruption, he had stopped to amuse himself by having a look at my face. "Maggot!" I cried. "You sewer rat! You repulsive, creeping—" Confound my genteel upbringing. I could not think of any name foul enough to call that evil wretch, as I plunged the knife into him. Into the swollen muscle of his upper arm, not his heart. Even such a monster I did not care to kill. With a hoarse cry he let go of his vile murder toy. Lady Cecilia dropped to the cobblestones. I think Alexander turned to face me, hands lifted to fend off my blows. But indeed I scarcely know. I remember only that I stabbed him again in the shoulder or arm, stabbed and stabbed again in a half-blind, blood-hued fog of fury. I did not know how many times I struck him, or how well or what words I ranted, or whether he tried to wrest the knife away from me, before I realized I was stabbing but nothing but the air. I blinked, hearing his running footsteps, and my vision cleared, so that I saw him clutching himself as he fled. Blood spotted the cobbles. And on the cold street, Lady Cecilia lay, crumpled amidst her rags, white and still. Heavens have mercy! I had been saved by a high, whalebone ribbed collar that night I was attacked, but she wore none. She sprawled as if dead. "Please, no," I whispered, starting to shake all over as wrath gave way to dread. My hand shook as, without conscious thought, I returned my dagger, all bloody, to its sheath in my busk. "Please," I begged the knight as I knelt beside Lady Cecilia, for in that moment I realized how deep the garrote had bitten into her delicate neck. And confound my hands, they trembled so badly that I could barely grasp the ugly thing, taking dreadful moments to loosen it. Frantically I felt at her throat for breath, at her wrist for pulse. I thought I felt a flutter of something, perhaps, but I quaked so that I could not tell for sure. Help. I needed help for the lady. And by a strange, maybe even providential chance, I knew where help was to be found. Close at hand. Lifting the lady's limp form in my arms, I staggered to my feet, blundering towards a modest office and residence nearby. Closed, shuttered, and locked for now, of course, for the night, but I stumbled up the white stone steps to the door, leaned there. Freeing one hand, I plied the brass knocker with all my remaining strength. I kept up my frenzied knocking until the door actually opened. Still clinging to the stricken lady, I staggered, nearly falling, into the front hallway. I only glimpsed the very startled parlour maid, who let me in, for my panicked gaze had fixed on the equally startled gentleman emerging from the library with an after-dinner drink in hand. "Dr. Watson." I tried to say something to him, but choked on my own words, for right beside the good doctor walked his dinner companion and friend, my brother, Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 17. Luckily, it was scarcely possible for me to react with more panic than I was already, revealing, in my agitation of manner, for my face remained hidden by its dense black veil. And luckily Sherlock Holmes's attention, like Dr. Watson's, was all taken up by the limp, very possibly lifeless girl sagging against me. "Good heavens!" Striding to me, Dr. Watson picked up Lady Cecilia as if cradling a child. Nearly running, he carried her into the warm, well-lighted library. Following, my brother asked, "Is she breathing?" "Only just. She was alive then." Hearing that, suddenly I felt lightheaded. Indeed, light of person, as if I might float. Such a burden had been lifted from me. Dr. Watson laid the lady upon a leather davenport and applied his trained fingers to her wrist. "Her pulse is weak. Brandy, Holmes." My brother was already striding towards the decanter, his back to me. The parlour maid stood at some distance from me, clinging to the stairwell, as if she might faint. At that moment, I could have simply turned, stepped out of the door, and slipped away into the darkness. I knew I should. There was no reason for me to stay. Lady Cecilia would be well cared for, and there was every reason for me to leave. Dr. Watson's attention might turn towards me, or the attention of his friend might do the same. My brother might recognize me. Moreover, at any moment, Lady Cecilia might regain her senses and say my name, which like a fool I had told her. Every nerve told me to flee. Yet instead, like an overlarge black moth drawn to a candle flame, I ghosted into the room with the others, with my brother, with the girl whom I had wanted to be my friend, and with the fatherly Dr. Watson. Kneeling beside his patient, removing the cord from her neck, Watson exclaimed, "What sort of brute would garrote a beggar girl?" He called towards the entryway. "Rose, send for the police." Rose, I suppose, was the parlour maid, who might or might not feel well enough to respond. At Watson's elbow now with the brandy, Holmes said, "That's no beggar girl. Look at her teeth. All her life they've been well cared for." Administering the brandy, Watson did not immediately answer. "Look at her skin, her features. Our guest is a lady." "If that's so, then what is she doing in such—" "I'm perilous, imperious," brother interrupted. "There is some mystery here." Hawk-like, he turned on me, where I stood just within the library door, perhaps 10 feet from him. His steel grey eyes fixed on my much besmirched mantle, and his eyebrows shot up. "Is that blood?" I suppose that on my black clothing, all dragged by the muck of the street, and in the gaslight it was hard to tell what the wet stains were. "Blood?" Glancing up to see what Holmes was talking about, Dr. Watson also looked at me. Then quite suddenly, "Madam, are you injured?" Actually, I was hurt. My face bruised and aching from Alexander Finch's blow, but I shook my veiled head to indicate the negative. Again, I could have fled, should have fled, but some pernicious yearning kept me where I was. Dr. Watson asked, "Why do you not speak?" "The sister in the streets is a mute, I have heard," Watson told his friend without looking at him. His grey gaze remained nailed upon me as if he might thereby pierce my veil. "Or perhaps she's hurt and in shock," said Dr. Watson. "That does look like blood. Quantities of blood." "We lack data to arrive at any conclusion," said Holmes, and he started towards me to investigate. I whipped out my dagger. My brother stopped where he stood, perhaps 6 feet from me. Everything seemed to stop in that moment, as I threatened in my razor-sharp, honed steel blade. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to stop. I remember utter stillness, utter silence. The knife's silver-colored tip wore a red veil. The silence stretched, then broke. Watson broke it, his voice a bit strained. I think it is not her blood, Holmes. I would quite like to know whose, murmured the great detective. Then he spread his hands towards me in a pacifying yet quelling gesture, and he started to protest, or cajole. My dear sister. His dear sister. Those words. How oddly they affected me. Do not condescend to me. I hardly recognized my own quite distinctive, aristocratic voice bursting forth, as it never would have done from under my veil. I am in need of no assistance. On the other hand, Lady Cecily, with a jerk of my weapon I indicated the still unconscious girl lying on the sofa, daughter of Sir Eustace Alistair, requires more care than I can give her. And although she was unlikely ever to receive it, care for her alienization of the psyche, her secret left-handed self. But if the police were on the way, there was no time to explain, I continued. The villain who garroted her? His voice, glassy and cracked, with incredulity, I suppose. My brother interrupted. Enola? His face had gone white, as keen and white as fine carved marble. Do not speak. Listen. There was no time for melodrama. I had to finish what I was saying. Please attend to what I am telling you. The garroter is Alexander Finch, a youth who once contrived to befriend the lady, and who has since mesmerized and kidnapped her. He masquerades as a Labour platform trumpet, named Cameron Shaw. You'll find his disguise on the street, and you're likely to find him in some surgery in a hospital with the marks of my knife on him. I could only hope that Dr. Watson had taken in most of this, for my brother evidently had not. He responded in much the same way as before. Enola? Having done all I could for the interests of justice, I softened my voice considerably. My dear brother, please put your mind at ease concerning me. The day I took my cipher booklet out of your desk, did you by chance find a handkerchief belonging to me, wrapped around a slice of onion? I wished to convince him, you see, that my weeping had been an actor's performance, to reassure him. But he seemed not to follow my meaning at all. He only leaned towards me, his alabaster features vibrant with barely constrained emotion. Enola, you must be sensible. You cannot continue in this foolish fashion, alone, unguided, wayward. Dr. Watson, gawking, seemed to say something, as I dreaded he should, but a movement and a groan from Lady Cecily claimed his attention. She would recover. With a pain, my heart let go of hopes for her friendship. I had to settle for knowing that she was safe now, and hoping that she would eventually find freedom, as I had. Sherlock, I told my brother earnestly and quietly, I'm doing very well on my own, thank you. Do you mean to tell me that you are all right? Quite so, although, I remarked, a bit worried about our mother, as I had not heard from her in response to my most recent message. Tell me where she is, then, and I will find her. Ah, you did not, after all, know everything, I replied. Such would not be her wish, no matter what extremity. And you, Enola? You insist on following her wilful example? You shall come to harm. My dear Sherlock, I told him almost tenderly, although I still held my dagger at the ready to keep him from approaching me. The greatest harm I could possibly suffer would be to lose my lone liberty, to be forced into a conventional life of domestic duties and matrimony. You cannot possibly mean that. Every decent woman's calling is to take her proper place in society. He stepped towards me. I stopped him with a gesture of my weapon. No nearer, I warn you. In fact, I could never have hurt him, but he knew me so imperfectly that he halted. I cannot believe a word you are saying, my dear sister. He all but begged. Let me see your face. It is little enough for him to ask, but I could not allow it. Dr. Watson might recognize Ivy Meshwood in me. No. In the same moment I realized it was a ploy to take my attention away from my weapon. One uses 2 hands to raise a veil. No, my oh-so-clever brother, I think not. Still my voice remained gentle. I hoped he could hear in its tone my affection for him. I am going now. Please convey my good wishes to our brother Mycroft. A considerable thumping commotion sounded behind me. At once lowering my knife to hide it in the folds of my mantle, I turned and sped out of the library, just as the parlour maid and a constable blundered in the front door. "Stop her!" my brother cried, but the parlour maid, quite excited, was tugging the constable towards where Lady Cecily lay, and before Sherlock Holmes could shout again, I had darted out the door, running down the street. "Stop her!" My brother's voice rang like a bugle in the night. I heard pursuit behind me, the constable's thudding footfalls, and my brother's lighter, longer stride. Like a hunted animal, I leapt an iron railing and thumping down into a servant's basement area. Fleeing for my very life, loss of freedom would have killed me. I sped out the back way and so into a maze of tool sheds, workshops, and animal pens behind the houses. As I paused inside a carriage house to catch both my breath and my wits, I heard my brother speaking with the constable. Then the latter halt at the call box in the street corner. Oh, how lovely! Within moments he would have every policeman in London on the lookout for me. "Bring me a lantern," my brother's commanding voice ordered someone. "She can't have gone far." I ran out at the other end of the carriage house and onward blindly, my thoughts frantic, despairing. Sherlock Holmes would search every horse stall, every cowshed, every shadow in the mews. On the streets police patrolled. There was no place to hide. My black mantle, my cowl, my veil, my habit, they marked me now and forevermore. I had to get rid of them. But then what? Run home in my yellow flannel underpinnings? In order to change my appearance and elude the pursuit, I needed a refuge. But where could I go? With every man's hand turned against me, and every woman's hand at the mercy of a man's. As I had chosen not to accept a lot of other girls, would it always be like this? Running, hiding, dodging, disguised. Enola? Alone? I did not allow myself to answer that question, forcing myself to think instead of what to do for the moment, as I emerged onto a cobbled thoroughfare and darted across it, recognizing it as somewhere I had been before. Baker Street. Of course. My feet, apparently possessing more intelligence than my head, carried me to the one place where my brother was least likely to search for me. My feet, with energy born of a new hope, I sped towards number 221, then darted behind the house. In the small backyard, as I had noticed on my previous visit, stood a single tree of the obliging, knobbly sort known as London plane. Up its excellent trunk I swam with no trouble at all, and after that it took only slight manoeuvring to climb onto the roof of the kitchen porch. None too soon, as I sat, panting, 2 constables passed on opposite pavements of Baker Street, the one calling to the other. "Gentlemen, scare," sergeant says. "With a knife, what I hear, and irrational," replied the other, "and to believe, but they say, dangerous." "Hysteria," said the other sagely, common affliction of the other sex. I wonder whether that was what Sherlock thought of me. Irrational? Hysterical? Yes, it probably was. After removing my boots, so as to be more silent, I padded across the roof to the window. I judged must lead to my brother's chamber. Gently I tried it, and it opened quite easily as I expected. It was not snibbed. My brother was, after all, still my mother's son, and a healthful sleeper, one who let in the fresh air at night. Slipping inside and closing the window behind me, already I was planning how I might search his wardrobe for something else to wear. I knew he kept many disguises. He had even at times passed himself off as an old woman. A skirt, a shawl, and a hat of some sort would be all I needed. Then I would wait and rest until I heard the door moving downstairs before I slipped out again, the way I had come. I knew I must never again disguise myself as the Sister of Charity. I wondered whether it would be safe to disguise myself as Ivy Meshel. Perhaps not. Holmes and Watson would surely discuss the night's events, and Watson might confess his visits to Dr. Raggerston now. I wondered whether I would ever see Lady Cecilia again. Probably not. The only way for me to be safe and free was to be what my name decreed me, Enola, alone. As I placed fresh fuel in the hearth fire of 221 Baker Street, I felt all the pain of that thought, but also some solace, whether he knew it or not, and whether he liked it or not. My brother Sherlock was giving me such shelter as family might offer. He was giving me refuge.